The morning her mother's casket was lowered into the ground, Lenora's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She almost didn't look. She was standing at the graveside, holding a single white rose the funeral director had pressed into her hand, watching the dirt fall in slow, heavy clumps. Her sister Rochelle was crying softly on her left. The pastor was still speaking, something about peace and reunion, but the words weren't reaching Lenora. She was somewhere else. She was back in her mother's kitchen, 14 years old, watching her mom press a dish towel to her hands and say, "Baby, the secret to a good life is knowing when to hold on and when to let go." Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out because some part of her, some exhausted automatic part, couldn't help it. The text was from her husband Damon. "When are you coming home? The sink is backed up and I can't find the plumber's number. Also, we're out of dish soap." Lenora read the message twice. Then she looked up at the sky. Pale gray February sky, the kind that gives nothing. And she made a decision. She just didn't know yet exactly what kind. People always want to know when things went wrong in a marriage. They want a date, a single event, a clear before and after. Lenora had spent years looking for that line herself. Was it the first time Damon rolled his eyes when she cried? Was it the argument about her going back to school? The one where he said, "What's the point?" so casually it didn't even register as cruel until 3 days later? Or was it even earlier than that, back when they were still dating and she mistook his need to be in control for protectiveness? The truth was there was no single line. There was just the slow draining of something. Like a bathtub with a hairline crack. You don't notice the water level falling until one day you're sitting in an empty tub, wondering what happened. Lenora Mae Collins was 34 years old when her mother died. She had been married to Damon Whitfield for 9 years. They lived in a 2-story house in Marietta, Georgia, the kind of neighborhood with homeowners association newsletters and seasonal wreaths on every door. From the outside, it looked exactly like a life that was working. She had met Damon when she was 24, during the 2 years she spent at her aunt's house in Atlanta after finishing her business degree. He was 31, already established, a project manager at a construction firm. He wore nice shoes and opened car doors and called when he said he would call. After the series of men in her early 20s who did none of those things, Damon felt like solid ground. She remembered telling her mother about him on the phone, sitting on her aunt's back porch with a glass of sweet tea. "He sounds steady," her mother had said. "He is, Mom. He's really steady." There was a pause. Her mother, Eleanor, was a woman who chose her words like she chose her shoes, carefully, and with the long game in mind. "Steady is good, baby. Just make sure steady isn't the only thing he's got." Lenora had laughed it off. She was 24. She thought love was something you built with a reliable person and a shared lease and the same sleep schedule. She thought the rest would come. They married when she was 25. The wedding was small and sweet, in a church in her hometown of Valdosta, 2 hours south of Atlanta. Eleanor cried. Damon's mother cried. Lenora thought she had done something right. Within the first year, she had quit her marketing job at a mid-size firm in Atlanta. Damon hadn't asked her to, not directly, but he had a way of making the alternative feel inconvenient. "The commute is too long," he said. "We both know my salary covers everything. Why are you running yourself ragged?" He said it with concern in his voice, and she heard it as love. She handed in her 2 weeks' notice 3 days later. She told herself she would go back when the time was right. The time was never right. The years passed in the way years pass when you stop marking them with your own ambitions. She cooked and kept the house and attended Damon's work dinners, where she smiled and asked the right questions and complimented the right wives. She was good at it. She was almost too good at it, because being good at something invisible means no one ever asks how you're doing inside it. Damon was not a monster. She wanted to be clear about that, in the way that only women who have lived with non-monsters understand why that distinction matters. He never raised his hand. He wasn't cruel in ways that left evidence. He was dismissive. He was condescending in the specific way of men who believe they love you but don't actually see you. When she talked about something that excited her, a podcast she'd heard, an idea she had, a class she'd looked up online, he would nod with that particular nod that meant, "I am waiting for you to finish." And she kept talking anyway. For years, she kept talking anyway, because stopping felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. What held her longest were the good stretches. Every marriage has them. Damon could be genuinely warm when things were going well for him at work, when he was relaxed, when the world outside was cooperating. He would take her to dinner at the Italian place she loved, and reach across the table and hold her hand, and she would think, "This is it, this is the real thing." She would reset the clock, she would stop counting. Then something would shift. A tough project, a bad week, a perceived slight from someone at the office, and the warmth would recede like a tide going out, and Lenora would find herself standing on the shore again, wondering how she'd been fooled into thinking the water was always that high. Her mother saw more than she let on. Eleanor had a gift for looking at her daughter and knowing without being told. But she was also from a generation that believed in honoring the choice you'd made, in giving things time, in not meddling. So she mostly listened, and sometimes said baby in a tone that said everything she wasn't saying aloud. It was only in her last year, after the diagnosis, that Eleanor started saying the things she'd been holding. She had colon cancer. Stage 3. She told Lenora on a Thursday in April, standing in her own kitchen in Valdosta, in the same calm voice she used to announce dinner was ready. Lenora had driven down that weekend and spent 2 days trying to convert her mother's house into something more manageable. Grab bars, better lighting, a new chair for the living room. Eleanor had watched all of this with patient amusement. You don't have to fix everything in a weekend, Nora. I know, I just want to help. Then come sit down and talk to me. They sat on the porch and talked until the sun went down. Eleanor asked about Lenora's life in a way she hadn't in a while. Not how is the house or how is Damon's job, but how are you, just you, underneath everything. And Lenora had cried in a way she didn't expect, ugly and sudden, and Eleanor had held her daughter's hand and not said a word until the crying slowed. You've been disappearing, Eleanor said finally. I've been watching it for years. You're still there, but some part of you keeps getting smaller. Lenora had no answer for that. She just squeezed her mother's hand. I'm not telling you what to do, Eleanor said. I never would. But I want you to remember something. Choosing yourself isn't abandonment. It never was. She drove back to Marietta that Sunday evening. Damon asked how her mother was doing. She said as well as can be expected. He nodded and turned back to the game. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. The next 10 months were the months of Eleanor. Lenora drove to Valdosta every weekend, sometimes more. She coordinated with her sister Rochelle, who lived in Savannah on doctors and medications, and the rotating schedule of family members who sat with Eleanor when neither of them could be there. Damon was tolerant of the arrangement in the way of a man who has not yet been directly inconvenienced. That changed around month 7. You're gone every weekend, he said, not unkindly, but with an edge that let her know inconvenience had arrived. I feel like I'm living alone. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, my mother is dying, Damon. I know that. I'm just saying. She didn't respond to the I'm just saying. She had learned over 9 years that some sentences from him were not invitations to a conversation. They were just sounds that wanted to be heard. She kept going to Valdosta. She sat with her mother through the treatments and the bad days, and the days that were surprisingly good, when Eleanor would feel strong enough to walk around the yard and point out which plants needed attention and which ones she'd given up on. Those days were Lenora's most precious thing. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in January. Lenora and Rochelle were both there. The hospice nurse had stepped out. It was just the 3 of them in that small bedroom, the way it had always, in the most essential way, been just the 3 of them. Lenora had held her mother's hand as she went. After, she sat in the car in her mother's driveway for a long time. She didn't cry right then. She just sat. She thought about what her mother had said on the porch that evening. Some part of you keeps getting smaller. And she thought about the 9 years. And she thought about the woman she had been at 24. The one who had a job she liked and ideas she hadn't yet learned to apologize for. She thought about whether that woman was still in there somewhere. The funeral was 4 days later, graveside, in the cold, with the white rose in her hand and the pastor speaking and Rochelle crying softly beside her, and the phone buzzing. The sink is backed up. We're out of dish soap. She didn't answer the text. She stood there until the service was over, and she hugged people she hadn't seen in years, and she helped Rochelle with the small logistics that follow death. And she did not cry until she was in the car alone on the highway home. And then she cried so hard she had to pull over at a rest stop outside Tifton and sit with her hazards on until she could see straight again. When she walked in the front door of the house in Marietta, Damon was on the couch watching television. He looked up. How was it? She stood in the foyer with her coat still on. My mother is buried, she said. That's how it was. He nodded slowly. He did not get up. He said, I called a plumber. It ended up being $200. And then he turned back to the television. Lenora went upstairs. She changed out of her funeral clothes. She sat down on her side of the bed. 9 years and it was still her side and his side, as if they were roommates maintaining agreed-upon territory. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, I don't want to be here anymore. Not nowhere. Not anywhere dramatic. Just not here. Not in this particular version of a life that had happened to her more than she had chosen it. She didn't say anything to Damon that night. or the next week. She was still in grief, still underwater, and she knew herself well enough to know that the decisions you make fully submerged are different from the ones you make when you've come up for air. So she waited. She went through her mother's things with Rochelle over 2 long weekends, dividing and boxing and deciding. In her mother's bedroom closet, behind a row of church dresses, she found a shoebox. Inside it were photographs, letters, and at the very bottom, a folded piece of paper. It was a list in her mother's handwriting. At the top, in Eleanor's careful cursive, it said, "Things I'm glad I did." Below were around 20 items. Taught myself to drive at 42. Stood up to Aunt Bea about the property. Took that watercolor class even though it was just me and a bunch of white women who thought I was lost. Told my daughters the truth when I had the chance. Near the bottom, chose myself when I needed to. Even when it cost me. Lenora stood in that closet for a long time, holding the paper. She thought about the conversation she'd never had with her mother, the one where she would have asked, "What did that one cost you?" Exactly? Her parents had separated for 14 months when Lenora was 12. They had gotten back together and stayed together until her father died. She had always thought of those 14 months as an anomaly, a blip, something the family moved past. She had never once, in 22 years, thought to ask her mother what it had felt like to come back, or whether she ever regretted leaving in the first place. She folded the list and put it in her coat pocket and took it home with her. That night she asked Damon a question she had not asked him in years. They were in the kitchen after dinner and she asked, "Do you know what I've been thinking about going back to? The marketing work. Maybe even graduate school. I've been looking into programs." He looked up from his phone. That look, she had memorized it over 9 years. The slight narrowing, the micropause before speaking. "Nora, we've talked about this. What's the point at this stage?" "I'm 34. I know how old you are. I'm just saying, the timing. The timing has never been right in 9 years, Damon. That's the thing I'm trying to tell you." He set his phone down. He gave her the patient look, the one he used when he was deciding whether she was in a manageable mood or not. "You just lost your mother. You're emotional. Let's not make any big decisions." She nodded. She said, "Okay." She went upstairs and got into bed and lay there in the dark, and listened to the familiar sounds of the house, and thought about her mother at 42, learning to drive, choosing herself when it cost her. She filed the application for the graduate program the next morning, at 6 a.m., before Damon was awake. It was a master's program in marketing analytics at Georgia State. She had spent 3 months quietly looking at it, reading the curriculum, calculating the cost, imagining herself in the classrooms. She submitted before she could think too hard about the consequences, the way her mother must have packed that one bag at whatever unglamorous Tuesday it was, before fear had time to catch up with intention. She got the acceptance letter 6 weeks later. She told Damon over dinner. What happened next would not have surprised anyone who knew them, but it surprised Lenora, not in the fact of it, but in how completely it confirmed what she already knew. He did not shout. He was measured and reasonable and methodical in the way he dismantled it. The cost, the logistics, the question, delivered with that patient concern, of whether she was really sure this was about her career, or whether she was still processing her grief and perhaps confusing the two. She listened to all of it. She let him finish. Then she said, "I'm going." He said, "Lenora." She said, "I'm going, Damon." And something happened that she had not predicted. She was not afraid. She had spent so many years bracing for this conversation, building it up into something enormous, a wall she could never get past. And now that she was here, on the other side of it, she just felt clear. The way you feel after a long cry at a rest stop on the highway, scraped out, but clear. She did not leave that night. Leaving a marriage is not one moment. It's a series of slow, deliberate steps that look invisible until the day they add up to a door. But the decision was made in that kitchen, and once made, it settled into her like a stone into still water. She stayed in the house through the spring semesters, attending classes 2 evenings a week, navigating the silence that had moved in between her and Damon like a third person. He was not cruel about it. He was withdrawn. He was waiting, she understood, for her to come back to herself, his self, the self that stayed. In April, she told him she wanted a separation. Rochelle had told her to expect fireworks. What she got instead was something harder to explain. He stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen, and looked at her, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do in years. It collapsed slightly. He looked, for a moment, genuinely at a loss. "I don't understand," he said. "I've given you everything." She thought about all the ways she could answer that. She thought about the job she'd left, and the dinners she'd attended, and the ideas she'd learned to keep to herself, and the years she'd spent getting smaller. She said, "I know you believe that, Damon. I think that's the thing I'm saddest about." She moved into a small apartment in Decatur that summer. 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a kitchen window that looked out over a courtyard where someone had planted a container garden. She stood at that window on the first morning and drank her coffee and did not make breakfast for anyone, and felt something strange and uncomfortable that eventually, after a while, she recognized as space. Her first semester finished that December. She earned a 3.9. She called Rochelle, and her sister screamed loud enough that Lenora had to hold the phone away from her ear. She laughed in a way she hadn't laughed in. She couldn't remember how long. She called her mother's voicemail. The number still connected, still Eleanor's recorded voice saying, "You've reached me. Please leave a message." And she pressed the phone to her ear and listened to her mother's voice. And then she said, "I think I found her again, Mom. I think she was in there the whole time." She stayed on the line until the voicemail ended. Then she sat on her couch, in her apartment, in the quiet that was hers, and she thought about the list in her coat pocket. And she thought about what it would feel like, decades from now, to make a list of her own. She already knew what the first item would be.